In this video, we'll take a look at a new experimental feature added in Unreal 5.4 called the texture graph. It will allow us to make textures and modify textures through a node-based interface. We can use this to create our own customizable or adjustable textures, such as this brick pattern. We'll also go over how you can make your own custom nodes as well for use within the texture graph. We'll start off by going up here to Edit, Plugins, and make sure that we have the Texture Graph plugin enabled and loaded. Once you're sure that's enabled, we'll be able to create a texture graph by going to our content browser and right-clicking and going to Texture, Texture Graph. I'm going to create a texture graph, and for now, you can name it whatever you want, but I'm going to call mine textgraph_test. And once you've created your texture graph, you can double click on it to open it up. And the very first thing that you'll see is this interface where we can start creating or modifying our textures. Now the top left has nodes that are available to use. There's not that many right now, but I assume they'll end up adding more. But by default, they're kind of shown as these blocks here, and I actually prefer to change this to a list view. I think it looks a little bit cleaner and easier to find things. But you can also find all these exact same nodes when you right-click, and you can search for them as well. Now, by default, we'll have this output. That's going to be what we end up with. Whatever we create, we'll be outputting the texture through here. And you can have multiple outputs, but for now, we just have one. Now, we can start creating nodes. So if we want to create a brick or tile pattern, maybe we'll start off with a node. So I'll go down here and we could see there's a section called procedural, and we can create a noise pattern or a pattern, a shape, a couple different things. And we're going to drag in a pattern, and by default it looks like this kind of tile. And if we start changing the amount of tiling there, we can start seeing this update. So you also have options or details for each node that you create. When you select a node, it'll display some options in this details panel. Now whatever node you're selected on is what will be displayed here in the node preview. If I select the output, it will display that which is connected to nothing. But if I connect the output to my pattern, now it outputs that pattern, and we even see it on this 3D preview in the bottom right. So that's kind of how we'll be able to look at what we're producing or making. If it's connected to the output, it'll be displayed in the 3D preview, but if you just select the node, then it's going to show it in this 2D node preview. You also have a histogram here that you can see for red, green, and blue and alpha channels, but for now, I'm just going to look at the preview. I find that a bit more useful. So if we want this to look like a bunch of bricks, and we want to have it where we can control the color and control the look of those bricks, but do this all procedurally, that's something we can start to build. We have this pattern that kind of looks like bricks. It's more like tiles, but we just need to change the tiling or the ratio and sizing of these squares to look a little bit more rectangular, to kind of look like bricks. So maybe what I'll do is I'll select this pattern, and we're going to change the repetitions on X to something like 5 and repetitions on Y to something like 16. Now we have something that looks a little bit more like a brick pattern, but we need some offset. So if we go to the offset, negative values will offset it to the right, and positive values will offset it to the left. If I put it to an offset of 0.5, now we start to get something that looks a little bit more like bricks. But it might be nice to have a little bit of a taper or fall off on the edges of them. So maybe I'll go to where it says bevel here and just add a tiny bit of a bevel, like 0.1. And then from there, we can also adjust this bevel curve. Maybe I want it to be a bit sharper because bricks look a bit soft of a fall off and start to appear a bit lumpy. So maybe I'll set the bevel curve to 0.5. And now we have something that kind of looks like a brick pattern. Now that we have the pattern figured out, maybe we want to start to add some color to it. So we're going to have to be able to find a way to mask out these dark values in between the bricks. We could technically use this as a mask, but since we have this bevel, then it would fade off. So we need a more controllable way to mask out only certain values. And we can do this, and I'm going to do this by creating a threshold node, and I can find that very easily by just right-clicking and searching threshold. And using this node, I can connect it to our pattern. But what I'm going to do is be able to set this threshold. So let's click on it and look at it. And by default, everything just looks kind of white, the same color. But I have this threshold here that I can change and threshold out different intensities or from those values. So this is a very good way to be able to mask out edges and certain things. So maybe I'll set this threshold amount to a different value. And one thing that I kind of don't like here, but is kind of important, is if you look in this details panel here, I have this threshold slider. I don't have a number value that I can really enter very easily. But if I go to the node and I click on the down arrow, then I have that threshold that I could actually control with another input or image. And I can also input a value here. So I can just set it to something like 0.3. And now it'll be set to like a number value instead of me having to drag this kind of dot along the slider and just guess where it is. You also can access that image input over here, but I find it a little bit easier in some cases to just look at the options underneath the image here. And for our pattern, we kind of have that, but it doesn't really show all the options. It shows the pattern type, but it doesn't show all those things like the repetition, spacing, and offset. So keep that in mind. There might be different ways of displaying the settings when you click on it through the details panel, and then also when you click on these arrows to drop down a more advanced view. But now I can threshold out these values much easier, and I can use that as a mask for colorizing this brick. So to colorize it, the next thing that I'm going to do is create another node called lerp, or linear interpolation. I'll do this by right-clicking and searching for lerp, and there's a lerp node, and you'll have your mask and then your input 1 and input 2. So I want to connect these up to colors, so I'll right-click and create a new color node, and I'll call this one grout color, and I'll create another color node, and I'll call this one brick color. And maybe the brick color will be kind of like a brownish red. And then maybe the grout color will just be kind of like a light gray. So I have my two colors and I can connect those up. So grout into input 1, brick color into input 2, and the mask is going to be this threshold node. And then I'll output the result from that. And you can see a preview here already of what we have, and that's starting to look a little bit more like bricks. It's not too bad. Now, if we look at our original pattern, we had this fall off here at the very edge that we kind of lose with this mask. We don't get that detail. So what I'm going to try to do next is multiply this original pattern with my brick color to be able to get this fade going from dark to bright to the center of the brick. So to do that, I'm going to kind of reorganize my nodes here a little bit to give some room. And what I'm going to do is create a multiply node, not multiply add, just multiply. And I'll connect the B value to original pattern, the A value to our bricks. And if we look at that already, now we get that taper, kind of dark from the edges to brighter in the center. And I'll use that instead. And now what I end up with is maybe a little bit more details on our bricks. So I'm just going to maybe realign this network to look a little bit cleaner. If we look at our output, okay, now we get that tapered darkness on the edges, which I think looks a little bit better. But now if I look at where the grout is, it's such a hard cutoff that it feels a little bit fake. Now, I know this isn't really realistic at all, but having such a sharp mask there for the edge doesn't really look that great. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add a blur, and I'll blur the threshold mask that we use. and go in here and change the radius of the blur. Let's try 3 and use that for my mask. And kind of just reorganize this graph a little bit, give a little bit more room. And looking at that, now we get a little bit of a blur at the edges, maybe feels just a little bit better, not as perfect pixel sharp, and helps it out a little bit. So already we've started to make a more controllable texture through using these procedural nodes. But we can take this one step further, because if we were to apply this on some objects in our scene, it'll look a little bit fake because it'll be lacking any sort of normals or bump map to fake some depth into those bricks. So it'd be nice to feel like the bricks are popping out a little bit more than the grout. So maybe what we'll end up doing is adding a normal map output. So right now this output is just called output, but we're going to give it a bit better name. We're going to click on it and go over here and call it maybe something like, instead of just output, we'll first rename this and call it output color. And that doesn't change anything in the details here. It's just the name of the node. But here in the details, this is a file that is going to be called when we export it. And right now it just says output. Maybe instead what I'll do is change that to something like color map or diffuse map or whatever you want to call it. And then you have settings for what quality it's going to export, what bit depth, and what kind of bit mapping or compression as well. Now, same thing we want to do with our normal map. We don't want to just output color. We want to output maybe normal, roughness, and other things. But for normal map, what I'll do is I'll right click and I'll create another output. You can create more than one output. So I'll create another output and I'll call this output normal. And then what we can do is go over here and export it as normal map when we export. And then what we need to do is generate a normal map from what we have here. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take this blur here, or take the threshold here, and we'll do a normal from height map. And that will take a black and white or a grayscale image and try to generate a normal map out of it. So I connect that up to our blur here and then output it. Let's see what it looks like. That's the normal map that it's giving me. So not too bad. Now the normal map won't preview down here. This only really shows color, and we can modify that. But the reason why that is, if you go to the 3D preview settings, it has this default material that it uses on this cube to display your texture or just display your preview. So that default material doesn't have normals or anything else connected up. So you only have one option to output one of your maps here. You can't, it's not a material that has everything connected. It's only just kind of your diffuse or your color. And you could specify, is that your output color? Is it your output normal? Now it displays my normal because I switched it to output normal. So if you want to have something here that shows normals and your color and everything all connected, you have to go make another material and pop it in here and have texture sample nodes that are converted to parameters, and then you'll have more inputs here. So that's something that you could do, but for now, this is totally fine for what we need. We already can see our normal map here, and we've kind of already made our network. So at this point, I can save my texture graph, and we're going to take a look at how we can make some custom nodes, because all these nodes are great that they have here, but there's a lot of stuff missing from here that we might actually want. So we're going to take a look at how we can make our very own nodes. But before we jump into that, there's a few other things in here that are useful. You also have some utilities here, like this new comment. So you can actually grab comments and attach them to your graphs. So if you want to kind of display a bit more information, you have a bigger graph, you want to put some reminders in there, you can right click, add a comment node, and then you can move this around and encapsulate nodes in it, and then they all move together. So it's a nice tool for just organizing your networks. Very similar to the shading networks that you can produce in Unreal. So not too much different from that. So how do we create our very own custom nodes? Well, the cool thing about Unreal is you can use any material inside these texture graphs. And let me show an example of this. If I go down here and I just right click and I search material, I can create a material input node. And you can choose a material that already exists in your scene. If I go down here and I search wood, I can choose one of these wood textures. And now it extracts the color value from that wood material. And I could change what we're extracting by clicking here to rendered attribute and choose the base color or the roughness or the normal. And then I can go mix those into my current existing graph. So because we can do that, because we can bring in other materials that we have, you can actually make custom nodes by creating materials. So if I save my texture graph and I minimize it, and I go into Unreal, and I go here to the content browser, and we create something like a material function, we'll be able to use that inside our texture graph. So if I go here and right click material, material function, and I'm just going to call it MF for material function underscore, and we'll make something simple. Maybe we'll make some vertical lines that we can control. So I'll call it MF underscore vertical lines. I'll open up our material function. And in our material function, I can do whatever network or whatever shading or whatever texture inputs you want, even input other textures that you've created and imported into Unreal. But we'll keep this procedural. We'll keep it adjustable. And I'm going to right click and create an input, function input. And I'm going to call this input maybe something like line amount, how many lines we want to create. So we'll have a control for this as well. It'll be something that we can easily control and modify. Now, what are we inputting? We don't want to input 3 values. For the line amount, it should just be a number. So I'm going to change this to an input scalar, so it makes it one single value. Now here's where it gets a little bit more complex. In this case, I'm going to use HLSL or shader coding to create these lines. Now, if this is something you're not familiar with, that's totally fine. I have a bunch of other videos on it on my channel, so you can always take a look and learn more about it. But it's going to be very simple. I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a custom node. And now I have this custom node here. I'll connect the input, but first we have to name the input. We're going to grab the line number, how many lines you want to create. That's what this will be. So we have to input that into the code here. So to do that, I have to have some sort of variable name to reference to it. So on my custom node, I'm going to make the input not called none. I'm going to make it called input. And now this here is going to be referenced to as input. It's our only input that we have right now. And I'll connect it up to the line amount. And then for our code here, we're going to use that input amount to control the number of lines we're going to create. So to do that, I'm going to remove this code, the default code, and I'm going to type in very simple one line of code, return, float, a number with decimal places, sine, so sine wave, and I'm going to use the UV coordinates of our texture in the x-axis, so that's like left to right. Y-axis would be up and down. So I'm going to use the UV coordinate numbers in the x-axis and times it by input, whatever number we put in here. And then I'll close those brackets, add a semicolon, and that's our output. Now the problem is, if I connect this, it's going to give me an error because it doesn't know what UV is. What is UVX? That's our UV coordinates, but I have nothing referencing the UV coordinates. So in our custom node, I'm going to have to add one more input. So I click on this plus here, and the input's going to be called UV, and I'm going to connect it up to a texture coordinate node so it can actually properly grab the UV coordinates. And now I should see lines. I don't because this line input value is 0 by default. Maybe I should make it something like 5 or 10 or 50. And now you can see those lines being generated. Now, when I type 50, it's not doing 50 lines because it's just multiplying our coordinates. And by default, our coordinates go from 0 to 1. So it's not really the line amount. I'd have to add a little bit of other math to properly do that. But you get the idea. 20, it's less lines. 100, it's more lines. So now that we have our material function created and made, and we have the ability to change the line amount, what I'm going to do next is create a brand new texture graph just to test this out. So right click in the content browser, texture graph. Let's call it text graph underscore custom. And I'll go into it. We have our output as we talked about. And I can right click, search for material, use material function, load in our material function, which would be the one we just created here, the MF vertical lines. I could just drop it in or search it there. And there it is. I can connect it to our output. And now it's shown on this cube. And if you want to change the amount of lines, we could see here that we have a line parameter because that's what we had for our input node in our material function. We have this input line amount. If you want more inputs, you just create them. Function input. You can have as many controls as you want. And you can access those controls through a texture graph. So I could have less lines or more lines. And now it's very adjustable. Maybe I want to flip those lines. Great. I can go here, create a transform node. Take our input. How do we want to transform it? And then our output. You want to rotate it? Okay. We can go in here. We got our zoom. We got our rotation. 90 degrees, 45 degrees. Very easy. Now, before we wrap up this video, how do we actually export our textures from here? We've created this brick texture that I'm just jumping back to now, but how do I actually export it so I can actually use it in materials? Because right now it lives in this graph, but I can't really get it out of this graph, and you can't use these graphs within materials. So the way that we're going to be able to export it is if you have these output nodes, like we've created here with the output color, output normal, when you go up here to export, you'll get a window that pops up and it'll ask you, what do you want to export? What output nodes do you actually want to save out? And you'll just select the ones you want to save out. You'll click export. And once you do that, you'll have them available in the content browser here as actual baked out and saved out texture maps. So now I have this color map, which is our brick texture, and I also have this normal map, which is the normal map for it. And you can go use those as any other sort of texture directly in your materials. You want to export them, you could right click and, asset actions, export and export them to actual file on your computer, bring it to another Unreal project or something. So you have the ability to save it all out. Now, it won't allow you to have changes. I can't go back to my graph, change the tiling of those bricks and have this texture auto update. I'd have to re-export it and then it would write over it and pretty much replace it with that new adjusted texture. So if you gave that a try, texture graph pattern, let's see how this goes. Let's make it 10 by 10. So now it's not so much a brick, but more of a tile. And that's what it looks like. And if we were to update this, export, okay, export, it exports, and now it overwrites it, and we have our new textures exported. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something new, don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you join the Patreon, which you can find a link to down in the description below, you'll also get access to the PDF of this video, which goes over all the steps we went over in a little bit more detail.